You can take your Bibles out and open them up to Matthew chapter 18. We are going to look, we've been in the Gospel of Matthew for most of the year. We will be probably until the end of the summer at this point in time. I chose to look at it through the lens of the 5 discourses that Matthew centers his gospel on as he wrote it. And so we are going to be now into the 4th discourse, and that starts in chapter 18. Let me read for us this morning the first 6 verses together. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea." Lord, your words are unlike any other words. When we take them, Lord, in their simple way that you present them, we find ourselves very humbled. So, Lord, I pray that we would all have ears to hear as you spoke, as you presently speak to us. I thank you for your presence here this morning. That is your promise. We will believe you. Lord, give me the words, but Holy Spirit, you're the master teacher. Come, show the Lord Jesus Christ to us this day, for we want to glorify his name, and we want to walk with him as his disciples. In Jesus' name, amen. So I have a very common thing here this morning, and now you're going to complete a line for me as I look at it, all right? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's? Thank you. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about fairness this morning. I don't think that's what Jesus was questioned about. But in some ways, this mirror and a mirror is something that we use to reflect. And many times, how many of you got in front of a mirror this morning? Oh, come on. Don't be bashful. Some of you guys should stand in front of a mirror once in a while. Mirror, mirror on the wall, I would phrase it this way: who's the greatest of them all? I would change it. Who's the greatest of them all? It's the great debate. Who's the greatest baseball player? Goes up for debate. Who's the greatest chef, cook? Who's the greatest seamstress? Who's the greatest slacker? Greatness is a term that we maybe don't always use it so forthrightly, but it is something that seems to be part of us. We're always kind of looking for greatness. We're doing comparisons. Greatness is sought by many, and sometimes it's sought in others or in themselves. It's sought in kingdoms and realms and places of power. So a question, not just to bring it home here, is who is the greatest at GBF, Grace Bible Fellowship? Maybe we don't always phrase a question quite so like that, but it is something that I think if we're honest with ourselves, we tend to look at the idea of greatness, bigness, mega. That's the term, that's the Greek term that's used here, mega. So what's a mega vitamin? It's a really big vitamin. It's got all kinds of stuff in it. So mega, large, big. And this is something the disciples asked. is a straightforward question. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So the then tells us there's something that precedes this. Who then is? So they had some kind of context for asking this question. And it doesn't come out of nowhere, this kind of question. And so we get a little bit of context for this question in Luke's gospel in chapter 9, verses 46 and 47, where we read this. An argument started among them, that is his disciples, as to which of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood him by his side. And so we know that preceding this, who then is the greatest, came from some kind of turmoil within the disciples group. Now remember, we saw that Jesus did send them out, and they did many miracles, and they cast out demons, and maybe even raised some of the dead. But in the context that we have here, it's very shortly after when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain, and Moses and Elijah sat and talked with him. But Jesus only brought, how many disciples did he bring up on the mountain? He brought 3. Now how would you feel if he did the other 9? And we see this on a number of occasions that Jesus would take aside these 3, Peter, James, and John. And so maybe it just comes out of naturalness that they are looking at these kinds of things. And so they were gathering, it says, together in Galilee in chapter 17. And then Jesus began to speak to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And he will be raised on the 3rd day, and they were deeply grieved. So Jesus goes from the mountain where he is transfigured, his radiance, his clothes glow like the sun, it says. And Peter somehow acknowledges this and says, let me build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then the voice of the Father comes over, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased, listen to him. And they get so scared, they do what most people do when they come in the true presence of God, they fall down. Next thing you know, Jesus is tapping them on the shoulder. Time to go down. And so when they go down, it's not contained here, but it's earlier in chapter 17. I think it's really important to set up this question of who is the greatest. Jesus comes down from the mountain, and he once again gets in the nuts and bolts and the dirty work of the gospel. I can almost say it that way, of the brokenness that he's around. And a man comes up and says, I brought my son to your disciples. He has a demon, and he neither rests. He sometimes throws himself into the fire or in the water. And I begged your disciples to cast him out, and they could not. And then we won't go into it. He says, oh, you perverted and perverse generation, how long must I put up with you? I've often wondered, who is he referring to? Collectively, I think maybe all of us, and maybe all the whole thing there, but just a weariness almost. And said, bring him here. And he cast the demon out. And the son looks almost, Luke's, I think it's either Mark or Luke's account say they thought he was dead. And Jesus goes over and he picks him up and gives him back to his father. Of course, the disciples are a little stumped here. Why couldn't we do it? Well, they move on. But again, we need, when you read the accounts of the Gospels especially, I think it's really, really important to try to get into the picture. Just like the parables can be overstated and torn apart and brought into all kinds of places they were not meant to be, sometimes we just overlook the setting that this is in. And just the simpleness of Jesus' illustrations as he deals with them. So what they've done now, they're moving back into Galilee. He's going to go back to Capernaum just one more time to Galilee before he makes his journey down to what he has already said, the Son of Man will be delivered up and he will be killed. And so it reads that they say that verse 24 in chapter 70, they came to Capernaum. Those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" Now again, it seems like they're phrasing this in such a way as they know he hasn't. So they're going to try to, hey, this is something you're supposed to do. Does your teacher not do it? Do you not do it? Well, we're going to see a clash of kingdoms here, or ways of thinking about kingdoms in this little event here that leads up to this question, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so Peter, Peter's kind of, just think of what he's come off. He's come off the Mount of Transfiguration. He's come down into the mess of what's going on. And then Jesus tells him these words with the other disciples that Jesus says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered up and killed. So maybe he's just kind of like rumbling this stuff around because it says they're grieved. And do you do your best thinking when you're grieved? Do you do your best thinking when there's a lot of pressures on you? So I think Peter feels a little trapped by this question. Does your teacher and do you pay the 2 drachma tax? And so he immediately does what he says. He goes, yes, of course he does. That gets him off the hook with these people. Well, we need to see something about this. And so this is how verse 24 works, the 2 drachma tax. We'll get a reference to this in Exodus chapter 30 and verse 13. This is Moses saying, "This is what everyone who is numbered shall give, a half a shekel according to the shekel of sanctuary." So we have a Greek coin, 2 drachmas put into place of the shekel. It's kind of like it's kind of like comparison, English pounds to American dollars kinds of things, but it equals the same amount. A half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. The shekel is 20 gerahs, half a shekel as a contribution to the Lord. So this is something, and then we're going to see another verse here. I think it's verse 15. The rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than half a shekel when you give the contribution to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. Well, this was a contribution given to the temple, the sanctuary first, the temple, to just maintain it. To buy the animals that were used for sacrifices, to pay the laborers who helped there. It's kind of like the maintenance fee for the temple, for the sanctuary. And everybody was required to pay it. Or everybody was supposed to pay it. And it was equal. Rich, poor, didn't matter. Everybody paid the same amount. So it wasn't a huge amount by any means. But what's he doing here? Is this a legitimate question? Is this a legitimate question from the people? Say, does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax? So they're trying to find ways to undermine the Lord in what he's doing. Peter answers yes. And then it's so fun. I like the King James. I consulted the King James next in this next verse. He walks into the house, probably Peter's house was the headquarters. He walks into Peter's house. Peter walks into his own house. Jesus is already in there. And before a word comes out, the King James says, Jesus prevents him. Now that sounds funny to our ears, doesn't it? But it just means that before Peter could say anything, Jesus said, Peter, what did you just do? Why did you do that? He says it this way, though. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, what do you think, Simon? Master, teacher at work. Jesus is the master teacher, and he leads off with this question. From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from their strangers? The way I can say it, and the way it might make sense for us today is our Congress, the United States, passes many laws. That's their responsibility in our tri-government. They're the ones that create the laws. They're the ones that have the control of the purse, that kind of stuff. Many times when Congress passes a law, some of you already know this, they exempt themselves from the very laws they pass. You can look it up. Not all of them. It's a protection, actually, in some ways. But at the same time, it's kind of the idea that we don't have to do what we say you got to do. We're free. We're free from this. And that's what Jesus is pointing Peter to here. He's helping him see something. Kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax from their sons or from strangers. Well, it doesn't take Peter very long. He says they collect it from strangers. And so then Jesus says, so the sons are exempt. They're free. They're free from that obligation, aren't they? Well, this idea of being free and the poll tax, the 2 drachma tax, what Jesus is saying to Peter is, it's an indirect reference to who he is. I am the Son of Man. I am the Son of God. I am exempt from my own tax, from my own responsibility. I do not need to pay because of who I am. They pay me. I don't pay. But this is where he is so exerts in some ways his gentle way of saying his greatness and who he is. But it's also a way of looking at the comparison of kingdoms and helping us to see the kingdom of heaven as opposed to the kingdoms of the world. But I love this idea of being tax exempt, don't you? In my daydreams, I can think sometimes, if I wanted a big reward, would I want a big medal? Would I want all kind of stuff? No, you know what I'd like? I'd like tax exemption for me and my family. The Vicks pay no taxes. Wouldn't that be really cool? Wouldn't that be a benefit? But here Jesus is taking this and he's basically saying you will be, and we're disciples will be free slaves. It's kind of oxymoronic. In other words, it's the idea that we remain slaves, but we're actually free. And this is where Jesus is going to take us in Matthew 18, because he's talking in this 4th discourse about the conduct and basically the character of the subjects of the kingdom, and I could directly apply it to the idea of what the church should be like today. What do people in the church, what should they look like? That's what Jesus is going to get at in this 4th discourse that Matthew gives us. And so, this being a reference to himself, he says, so we won't offend them. This is really important. This is one of those places, if you like to mark your Bible up, he says, however, so that we do not offend them, verse 27, which is the same word that we're going to see down in verses 6 through 9, especially next week, is this word scandalon, scandal. And it's the idea of tripping up. So if you're a Bible marker, you will see this thing coming up in verse 6, stumble. Verse 7, stumbling blocks, stumbling blocks, stumbling blocks. Verse 7, 3 times. 8, stumble. Verse 9, stumble. So we're going to look at that next week. But it's translated in the last verse of chapter 17 as that we should not stumble them, offend them. And then he does an amazing thing. He says, Peter, go down to the dock. This is Capernaum's right on the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee. Go down there, throw your line in. The first fish you catch, bring it up, open its mouth, and you'll find money. Take it and go pay our taxes. That's pretty neat, isn't it? So again, I'm going to use my imagination. Somewhere when this was happening, the Son of God, the creator of all things, indicates to this fish somehow, go down there. Somebody dropped some coins there a few days ago. Go swallow them and then bite this line and bring it. It sounds too fantastic to believe. In fact, there's people that will try to explain it away, which they do to a lot of Scripture. I'm sorry, I'm a little kid. I believe that. Because he's the master. He never gives it up. So, Peter does it. Goes down, finds a shekel, which is equal to 4 drachma, I guess, and take it and give it to them for you and me. And here again, Jesus is not just protecting himself. Who else is he protecting? When you're a believer in Jesus Christ, who protects you? He does. So when we follow him, when we apprentice to him, when we walk with him, who protects us? He does. And here he protects his disciple, his Peter, who is, as we know, many times talks before he thinks. I'm very familiar with that activity myself. And so in chapter 18, we come to this thing here where there's a major, like I've said, there's a major thing that we're going to see in this 4th discourse. And it has to do with, and again, hence the title of my message this morning, it has to do with the idea of Mega Microns. Mega is large, and micron, even today, if you go look up micron, it's 1/1,000,000th of a meter long. And these are terms that are here. Verse 6 is little ones. That's the idea of micron. It actually would say, the Greek would probably say micron, but we call it micron, so it's very small. But their question is, who's the greatest? Who's the mega? And Jesus is going to take that question, and he's going to fill it in with the idea that who's the greatest? Microns, little ones. This does not translate well to Wall Street. This does not translate well to men's kingdoms. Most men's kingdoms don't know what to do with true believers in Jesus Christ. They don't fit any mold. They just don't fit. Because they have another master. They serve a great king. And he takes little ones and he makes them great for him. So the kingdom is full of mega microns, great little ones, you could almost say. That's what the kingdom is full of. Great little ones. So Jesus says to Peter, we don't want to scandalize these guys that are looking for the tax or whatever. We don't want to needlessly offend them, trip them up, make it harder for them than it needs to be to see what's what. And that's what Jesus does for us. He helps us to see what's what. He helps us to see the way things really are. That's what he does. And so we come to this main body that I wanted to be at today in verse 1. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Well, I'll cheat. You go down to verse 4 and you've got it. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So he answers the question, but how does he get there? Well, I have this illustration. I do this one because I'm familiar with it. This was my branch of the service when I was in the service in the military. This is the rankings of the enlisted people in the Marine Corps. And of course, private has nothing, honestly. There's nothing there. Of course, that means he's the lowliest. And so then you got the sergeant majors, they're the highest. They're the greatest. So it's comparison. And I can just remember being in the service, and even to this day, when I see these things, it brings me back to the idea of putting people in the right place. And for the military to work well, this needs to happen. This needs to happen because you've got to have order. But what we have happening here in Jesus speaking to answer the disciples' question, as he's now answering our question about this as well, he's helping us to see a different kind of order of greatness. This is very normal, though. This is, people today you may not see people walking around with these things, but we kind of know. If a United States senator would come into our midst, what would he be seen as? Well, it depends on which party you're from, I guess. Okay, we've shot that thing down. But the idea that we do this, we put people up, we take them up, we pull them down, we do all these kinds of things. And Jesus is going to show us something. And that's what he's doing to his disciples as well. So the teacher instructs them, and he instructs us now. Verse 2. He called a child to himself and set him before them. This is so important to this. You never lose sight of the child in this incident. Don't lose sight of the child, where it's at. The way I picture it is not that the child, Jesus is here and he brings the child up like, Marilyn was just up here and you're over there and she's up here. The way it seems to, in the idea of in the midst, seems to be in a house. If you've ever gathered in a big gathering in a house, does everybody sit on one side of the room? They sit all over the place. And so then you had this conversations going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so remember, these disciples had been on the road arguing with each other, which of them was the greatest. And they're now looking across the way at somebody going, that guy thinks he's better than me. And the guy on the other side is looking back at him and says, that guy thinks he's better than me. Greater than me, I guess would be a better way of saying it. He's the big shot. And maybe the other 9 disciples are like, hey, those, Peter, James, and John, they always sit together over here. Now, I know I'm going beyond what I can actually say happened. But Jesus, in answering this question, brings a child, 7, 8 years old, puts them in the middle of the room, puts the child in the middle of the room where he is. He calls the child to himself. So this is what they're seeing. They're seeing a child next to Jesus, a little one, a paideia, small one, little one. And then he says this. So he brings the child in, then we read, Amen. That's what truly means. Again, I love that. It's just so fun. This is not an amen group of people out here. You guys would flunk Southern baptism. Amen. Truly, I say to you, he says to them, I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's illustrating, just like he did in his parables, only this is not a parable. This is an example of a child right next to him. Unless you become like this child in your midst, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You will not be one of the citizens there. Unless you are converted. That's the way the New American Standard reads here. Unless you are converted. I think it works, but it's the idea of strepho. It's the idea of changing directions. It's not the word repentance. It's similar, but it's the idea unless you change the way you think and believe and live by that, you must change the way you think. You need to get rid of that ranking system, and you need to see differently to be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. Change directions, strepho, go the other way, see what's what. There's some of you have watched this series lately. It's Chosen. This is one thing I do really like. I like this illustration. I think in Felix Meyer, if you'll see him walking around here once in a while, it's getting warmer now. He has a sweatshirt that has this picture on it. And I like this because this is kind of the idea of Jesus, unless you change directions. And so if you've ever watched The Chosen, they start out, all the fish are swimming the same direction. All of a sudden, one flips direction and goes a different way. And then more begin to flip direction. So the blue ones are going against the flow. They're going against the stream. They're going against the way the world looks at things. They have a new way of thinking. They have a new mentality. They have a new spirit. And something else is controlling their trajectory. Something else now has them. They're not just going along with the way things were. Now they're going in a different direction. Now they are being changed. In some ways, I don't know that I can force it I'd have to be careful to force it this way because, again, I said last week, how many times did Jesus actually raise his voice? Was it frequent? Very infrequent. So here he is speaking to his disciples. He's not chewing them out. You dummies. He's just very gently challenging their thinking. Change, he says. Become as a child, he says. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This as has the idea of, it's a comparison word. As this child, like this child. Now wait a minute. Are we supposed to drum up something inside us? Like, have you ever tried to be humble? It's really hard, actually. I'm so humble. And this is, I think, a danger we get into when we get to this verse, or what Jesus said here. I don't want to keep away from saying verses. I want to say from what he said. Unless you humble yourselves as this child. This is where the picture needs to come in again. As this child. Remember, he's in a room, he's in Capernaum, he's in Peter's house probably. It's pretty crowded. We don't know who this child is. Wouldn't that be fun? I was that kid, later on in the first church or something like that, I even got a photograph of it. The idea is, as this child, what did the child do? It's in verse 2. I think it's in verse 2. He called a child to himself and set him before them. What did the child do? He came. He came to Jesus and he stood beside him. So when he says, as this child, he's really literally using that very moment with that very child to demonstrate kingdom citizens. All we do is we listen to the master and we come to him. We humble ourselves by coming to him and recognizing him, who he is. So Jesus is answering the question of the kingdom of heaven. And this is so opposite of greatness in the world's eyes. Me come to him, let God come to me. Now, I don't think any of us are that bold to say it quite like that. But there are many people who have a picture of a God, not the God, a God who serves them, not they, him. And this is the humble, this is the converting, this is the changing, this is the reversing of what is natural. And Jesus says this, you must become as this child. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And I love this idea of whoever. There's 3 of them in a row, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6. Whoever. This means there can be multiple greatest. That doesn't sound right, does it? Who's the greatest? There's a lot of them. Multiples. Servants, Jesus' servants all over the world. I have a brother and sister here that are missionaries to Thailand. They reintroduced themselves to me here a little bit ago. in Thailand. There are some greatest people there. They're followers of Jesus. My brother and sisters over in the Middle East that I just have such a longing, just kind of a way of being with them in my spirit. World's eyes are nothing. Especially in the eyes of Islam, they are absolutely nothing. They're worse than nothing. And Jesus says, as this child humbled himself and came to me, these are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. There's room in the kingdom for a lot of Mega Microns, little ones who come. So this is in some ways an indirect, or maybe it's a direct. I couldn't figure out my mind on this one. Is this a direct rebuke of the disciples or an indirect rebuke of the disciples who, we're arguing between us, who's the greatest or whatever? I kind of see it more as an indirect rebuke to them. Because Jesus now has this 7-year-old. I'm just going to give him 7. It could be anywhere from 5 to 8 or whatever, I guess. But he has it here. And in their culture, and in the culture of most places in the world, except for crazy places like our country, where we make little queens and kings out of little kids who don't deserve it yet. Did I say too much wrong there? I don't know. That child is basically almost nothing. Does not really have any place in society other than to be obedient to mom and dad and do what they're told to do. And now Jesus is saying, here's an example of the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So I think, again, just like them, the disciples then, just like today, that needs to do some digging stuff up within us. Because we have a tendency to still want to be better than most, higher than others. You know what I like to say, we're all born with what in our hand? Born with a gavel in our hands. We love to judge. We love to compare. We love to moan when we don't measure up to this and to that, and to who and to what. And yet Jesus is very gentle because he tries to help them see something. I think we need to see this as well. Because the kingdom of heaven's greatness is to reflect its king. That's what we're supposed to do. We are reflectors. We are to be reflectors of the king. That's what citizens of heaven are. They're reflectors of him. We don't have the shiningness in and of ourselves. The shining within us comes from him. And as we walk with him, that starts to get into us. I think that's the way that's probably theologically, I don't know, but you get the idea. Because later on in the book of Acts, one of the things that the authorities noticed, the world authorities noticed, the religious authorities at the time, they go, I don't know what's going on with these guys, but one thing we do know, they hung with Jesus a long time. They were the ones that were with him. And that's what we need to be too. As his followers, as his disciples, as part of the kingdom present now, we reflect him. We need to hang with him. We need to think like he taught us to think, act like he's taught us to act, follow in the obedience that he's asked us to walk into. So Jesus shows us now that as a child came when he called him, come, Jesus says, when I call you. Come when I call you. I think that then works itself into again, I keep it to us, the local church, that comes into places where we learn the walk of obedience, the walk of discipleship, the walk of apprenticing under him, in our midst, following things that he's, doing the things that he's shown us to do. The giftings. Every one of you as a believer in Christ has a gift. Has a way of, it's almost a present for him, from him, for you to be with him and with each other. Operate within that. Learn it. Find it. Use it. Most of you will not have the ability to talk to people like our brother Leo over there. But what I like about Leo is he walks in obedience to the personality that God has given him. And I think that's available for all of us, to walk in the personality, to walk in the things that he's taught us. Now, I know this, because I was raised in a world system, I know I've got some hanging-ons from that world system in my way of thinking. And I'm learning, you're learning, to let go of those things and pick up other things and use them instead. But the danger that happens with the idea of greatness is that we begin to look within. That's what the disciples were doing. They were looking within. Oh, I will be Jesus' favorite. You must be Jesus' favorite because he always takes you and we don't get to go. But what's wrong with me? And so we begin to look within. But a kingdom of heaven citizen reflects its king. It looks without. He says in verses 5 and 6, and actually we're going to pick up on this next week. We're going to talk a lot about scandal next week. I just think it's important for us to see the idea of scandal and what it is to be tripped up for the kingdom, but in the kingdom or without it. So we'll look into stumbling blocks, scandalon, that kind of stuff next week. But he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Remember again what's happening. Here's the child next to Jesus. Maybe some of them had the opinion that I heard in older people sometimes, kids are to be seen, not heard. Now, again, in our culture, we've changed that dynamic. It seems like in some ways the idea of youth is actually lifted up more, and us old gray hairs are kind of put down. But much of the world doesn't think that way. Kids are just kind of like, they're coming, it's coming. So Jesus takes a little child, puts it in their midst, and says, receive this child like you receive me. If you respect me, if you love me, then you will not look down on this little one here. You will not look down on any of my followers. James and John, again, we saw these guys casting out demons in your name, but they're not part of our group. Should we get rid of them? And Jesus says, no, you're getting it wrong again. They're for us, not against us. This has been a huge mistake, I believe, and I'm going to keep it here. This has been a huge mistake within evangelicalism. We end up fighting with each other, arguing over doctrines, arguing over this and over that, minutia, that kind of stuff. Is some of it important? I'm not denying that it's not important. But the most important thing is to be a true turner to Jesus Christ. Unless you turn, unless you change, follow me, unless you change and become like this child, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. There's going to be a lot of people in evangelicalism who are going to get to the pearly gates and turned away. It's scary for me to think about. Whoever receives this child receives me. Welcomes them with interest. Welcomes them with interest. Welcomes them. It's like everybody's welcome. Oh man, I just want to get to know you. You. Who are you? What do you do? How do you? I'm still fascinated. I go sit in the sauna up in Bayfield, and maybe it's part of my gift. I just start talking to people and that kind. And I've had 3 or 4 people go, I didn't expect to talk this much. They share their stories with me. Because there's a certain way in which we can talk to people that they start to share their stories with us. But if you're only talking about you, What's going to happen? Enough of that. So dekamai, it's the idea of receiving. It's to welcome with interest in others. So Jesus is saying, see this child? Don't look down on them. Welcome him. This is going to be so important as the church grows in the book of Acts and the fights and things that happen there and are still happening today. We must welcome. James talked about that. If a wealthy man walks into your assembly, do you tell the guy that's sitting here to go back there, the poor guy to go back there, and let the rich guy come sit up here? James caught it. He wasn't even part of the disciple group at this time. You welcome. You welcome. You find a way to welcome people, Jesus said. Because you never know. In fact, later on in verse 10, we're not going to get there. See to that you do not despise one of these microns or microns, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually see the face of their Father who is in heaven. I like that. I've always assumed that my family has guardian angels. As a believer in Jesus Christ, I assume guardian angels. I just never seen their mugshot yet. Maybe that'll be one of the first introductions someday. Hey, I was there when you were there. Whoa, cool. All right, I need to wrap this up today. Romans 13, 14, and then into the next chapter. Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lusts. Now, most of the lusts that we tend to, again, we default to the idea of the physical and lusts, but really a lot of the lusts that we have are for greatness. We have this lust for being great, for being better, or at least not as bad, or you can put all kinds of equations in there. But it keeps us looking at ourselves. When a follower of Jesus is really somebody who has a way of reflecting back the relationship of the Lord himself with them. And so then Paul goes on and says, now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. And we're not going to go deep into this, obviously. But it's amazing. I have caught myself many times entering into judgment in my thought life when I've met somebody. Have you done it? Have you found yourself there? And Jesus is saying, relearn this. Go back to school. Learn this. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is answered. He is. And then we reflect him. We can't overlook the illustration of the child. Otherwise, we lose the whole lesson that's here. And I'm going to try something. I don't know if I can do it or not. I didn't think this through as well as maybe I should have. But let's see if it works. So here's the dumb question. What's this? Okay, can you see yourselves? All right. Now, I don't know if I can do this or not. I think I might need 2 mirrors. But can any of you see me in here? Can you see me in here at all? Can you see the cross? Oh, let's back up here. I didn't know if I could do this or not. See, actually, I should have 2 mirrors. In fact, that's what you should all be mirrors right now. So then when I look in this, what I'm seeing now is the cross. And so it's coming back up here, and then it goes back out to y'all. And y'all bring it back this way and back this way. That's what we're supposed to be seeing. We are supposed to be looking in mirrors, but when we look into that mirror, it's not fair, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the greatest of them all? That's answered right there. And then I reflect and you reflect him. These are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Lord, I know that you are here because you promised. As you brought a child into the midst of the disciples, you promised to be in the midst of these disciples here today. So Lord, help us to see each other as that child that you brought to be beside you. I know, Lord, going into the lessons that are coming in Matthew 18, I know that some of these are just hugely, hugely heavy. Because we still wrestle with our own fallenness, our brokenness, our sin, and we wrestle with each other's fallenness, brokenness, and sin. But Lord, I know that your way is for us to keep our eyes fixed on you so that when we see the other, we see you. And Lord, these are lessons that Grace Bible Fellowship needs to grow in. I need to grow in, we need to grow in, that we may truly reflect the light that you are in this world. So be pleased to visit us, be pleased to be in our midst, and may we, Lord, recognize that you are in our midst. And that we would humble ourselves, just like that child that came to you. We would just come to you in the same way and trust you. So Lord, I thank you for this day. I bless those people that are here this day that have come. I ask for your work in their lives, that they would see you and people would see you in them. For I ask this in the mighty name, the greatest name, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.